I'm going to share my life-changing experience with you, but I asked my email and my name to remain anonymous for fear of ridicule I've already experienced with family and friends. You know the type of people who ridicule people. The good people are those who get it. The cowards and teasers, and they're just scared. That's all they are. I am from the United Kingdom, England specifically, and after serving 7 years in the British Army, moved to the United States and gained my residence. I'm now a police officer in the US. I'll leave that out. 3 years ago I was on duty at the end of a busy night shift, and I got a call asking me to attend a property where a lone young woman heard lots of noise coming from the backyard and fearing an intruder. It was roughly 4:30 a.m. Another officer and I, who we'll call by his initials, we'll just say, I'll mix those up too, we'll just say it's Adam. The house is located about 3/4 of a mile from neighbors. As you get to the property, I have to drive up a rough track surrounded either side by dense tree cover. Adam and I arrived at the same time, so I followed him up and we left his vehicle outside the property with the lights on. Straight away, the female came running towards us, crying her eyes out and frightened beyond belief. In between breaths, she told me she heard someone outside her window. She heard the sound of her garbage cans being moved. It was raining and she heard soft grunting or groaning. To me it sounded like a peeping Tom or stalker preying on a young woman. So the lady took shelter in the former's car. Adam and I moved with weapons drawn to the rear of the property and could not see anything near the house. But the garage cans had been tripped over. We shot our flashlights around the area and again nothing was seen. I went back to the car and checked on the woman. I stood and moved the cans back against the wall of the house. Just as I was finishing, I had this feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on my neck stood on end and I had a tingle run down my spine. It was similar to when I knew I was being watched and went out on patrol in Afghanistan. The tree line was maybe 55 to 60 feet back from the house, and I had my back to it when I was shifting the garbage bin. I stood and very slowly turned around when I saw a movement between the trees, and I said something because I couldn't clearly see it. Because of the time of day, stood from a crouching position. There's an extremely bulky individual at this point. I could only make out the outline when crouched. Its head seemed to be 4 feet off the ground, and for what I could gather its shoulders were about 5 feet wide. I yelled at the figure. I can't remember what, but Adam later told me heard me yell and sounding panicky. As I yelled at this thing, I drew my sidearm and it stood up. All I can say is that it truly was massive, about 8.5 feet tall. I still couldn't see anything in great detail because I was still rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I was in the weaver position with my gun held up when the figure grunted. It was terrifying. This lung capacity must have been immense. Adam was yelling and running around the house to get to me and heard the grunt. The figure took off deeper into the trees and I didn't follow. In fact, I didn't do anything except stay rooted to the spot. Adam later told me he didn't see anything but heard the deep growl and thought I was being set on by a bear. The woman didn't stay home that night. We dropped her off at a neighbor's house. Adam and I reported what happened to our superior officer, who recommended we get psych tested. Your superior officer is a douchebag. It soon spread around her colleagues that we'd seen Bigfoot and became the laughingstock of the police department. I said not to mention it to my family, but the news eventually reached them, and everyone except my wife and my stepmother believed I had some sort of mental breakdown. That's pretty sad, isn't it? It's all because we're not informed of the honest truth, and that's the only reason Adam left the police shortly after and we lost touch. I'm still in the police department, but I'm extra cautious when responding to calls myself, and at night I keep an R15 in the car with a standard load. Out, and I have the 12 gauge in the boot or the trunk, as you guys say, with slug rounds, and just in case I needed something. That night was warning me, and it wasn't friendly at all.
You can call me BJ. I'm a veteran from Oklahoma. This has been a long time coming, and after watching your videos, which in my opinion are the best thing on the internet bar none, I truly believe it's time to share this with someone who I know won't judge or belittle my sanity in any way. Thank you for that. You have no idea how much that is appreciated. And sir, you are absolutely very welcome. I've got you back, as have literally thousands of other people on the planet, and thousands of people watching your story today have your back too. Okay, you're not alone. This took place in Nevada in 1979, just outside of Bridgeport, on the backside of the Sawtooth Range. A friend of mine had asked my assistants to help track down whatever was killing his sheep and 2 of his dogs. I was in the military and have hunted and lived in the outdoors for the majority of my life. Being from Oklahoma, it's what you do. I arrived at my friend's place early in the morning and asked him to take me to this site of the last kill, which had happened only 2 days previous. There was sign everywhere, especially coyote, but that was quickly ruled out when he told me that several of his sheep had been dragged almost a quarter mile to an outcropping before they were eaten. After several minutes of circling the site, I found what I was looking for: cat tracks, and not a small one by any means. I told him he could go with me if he wanted, but this was going to be a long and tiresome search, so I advised him to contact the game warden and let him know our plans, just to make sure we stayed on the right side of the lawn. This ordeal halfway through the day, I climbed one ridge almost 2 miles from where I started. It was a bright day, with the temperature pushing 70. I thought about going back and starting again the next day, but the trail is fresh, and there is what looked like a couple of small openings in a rock face above me. I came within 50 yards of that first opening in the rock, and when I lost the track I circled around above and below me, but to no avail. I returned to where I had originally lost the track and discovered fresh tracks heading back the way it came. He got in behind me and had evidently watched me approach. I started back down the way I came, which ran around one side of the ridge. I started into the curve of the ridge, where I knew where to be a large overhanging rock shelf above head level. I stopped and checked to make sure I had a round chambered and safety off. Just as I started to move on, I heard and felt something very big hit the ground behind me. At the same time, there was a scream from the cat that sounded like it was half muffled. I peered back around a rock to see this huge reddish-brown hairy being not 30 feet from me, standing with his arms over his head and the big cat in his hands. The being sounded like it coughed and then brought his arms down together in one motion, which produced a large cracking sound from the cat, which immediately went limp. The being looked at me for a couple seconds, then pitched the cat out and down the ridge, where it landed a good 50 yards downhill. I couldn't move, and the being didn't move either. Finally, I stopped and laid my rifle on the ground instead of my arms up and my palms out. The being, after several seconds, did the same thing. It finally turned and leaped back from a standing position a good 15 feet up above me and kept going up the ridge till it was out of sight. Wow. Being totally shocked, which had never happened to me. Ever I've been in combat, I'm not afraid of a damn thing or a person. But this being had me froze with my mouth open. The best I could describe this thing would be enormous. It stood at least 8 feet tall, and my guess is that it had to weigh in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 pounds. A sloping forehead, flat broad nose, and very little if any hair on his face. I couldn't remember if it had ears or not. I don't remember seeing any. His chest had before feet across his shoulder. His shoulders and arms were massive, its biceps had to be in the 30-inch range, and its thighs were double that easy. I don't recall any smell, but I probably wasn't too concerned about a smell at the time, and yes, it was a male. I got back to the house of my friend at around dark. Still not quite sure if what I'd seen was real or not. I tried to explain to him what happened. He laughed and accused me of being under the influence of altitude sickness. I've never told anyone, because I've been trying to tell him. Every now and then I see that being. I wish I could have told him back then. I remember that being. I wish I could have said thank you for saving my ass or something. I've been a reverend for nearly 25 years and have always made it how to walk, to exercise and meditate as much as my weekly schedule allows me to. Oh my God, my face is frozen. I was asked to help out at a struggling church for a season, which required my family to move to new area. The town was nestled close to 3 adjoining East Coast states. I found a local park with plenty of acreage to walk, and it seemed very peaceful. I had been using the park for 10 months. When the encounter took place, I heard some unusual noises through the 10 months, but attributed them to being in a new area with new sounds, etc. There was a path in the back of the park that was sort of shaped like a very large horseshoe, and in the middle of the path grew tall wild grass. The grassy area was usually filled with bird activity, which I liked. One early morning I entered that path, like I normally do, and it was literally dead quiet, and there were no bird sounds at all. It hit me immediately how odd that was. I took maybe 25 to 30 steps into the path when I heard rustling to my left in the tall grass. I thought maybe I disturbed some sleeping deer, but then I heard what sounded like a horse blowing through its mouth to my right. As I looked to my right, I saw what looked like a large heavy man covered in hair, just standing there, sort of facing slightly away from me. It just stood there, and I was struggling to understand what I was looking at. Then the noise to my left exploded through the grass away from me, and I thought I could see the grass moving. I never saw what was there. My head started ringing, which was really weird. I guess it was adrenaline. Then I looked quickly back to my right, and this thing standing there quickly shot down to the ground to its left and crawled away at a speed that seemed completely impossible. I'm not sure how to explain how it crawled away, but the only thing I can equate it to is an insect. It looked like a long hairy insect crawling at high speed. Once he was moving away, I turned and ran like a scared little boy. I had no idea what to think or say afterwards. I've tried to sort it out and prayed a lot. I guess my question at this stage is, why don't we know about these things, right? I had a parishioner years ago came into my office to talk and eventually get his siding off his chest. I really believed he believed what he saw, but I had no information or any way to relate to him, sadly. I do now. I know this all sounds far out, and after all this time I'm still attempting to sort it out, but this really happened, and I'm suspicious about what these things are and his purpose here on earth. I now take my early morning walks on the paved roads and sidewalks in my neighborhood. I'm not sure I'll ever be comfortable enough again to be in around wooded areas. I'm not a wimp, but from what I've experienced that morning, it's not something I'd like to see or feel again in this lifetime. My name is Dave, and I live in Washington, and I'll try to make this as brief as possible. Sorry if I have too many details. The closest I found to what I saw at age 16 in 1982. Well, elk hunting in Washington state, on the breaks in the Columbia River, is a Sasquatch, at least 10 miles below any trees. All sagebrush and rim rockets at the head of the Bryant Canyon is covered. It is covered with wind machines now, but I'll never forget that day, as long as I live. I was with 2 other teens while our fathers were hiking the canyon toward us, hoping to drive to Elkhart. We all had rifles, a 7mm mag, a 308 and a 30-06. We watched it walk to the bottom of the steep incline from over a mile away to within 100 yards of us. maybe 7 or 8 minutes time. Could you imagine that? Having something over a mile away and watching it walk up to 100 yards in sand. Imagine having a video camera for that. Holy crap. Of course they didn't, but no big deal. It had the same blonde color for 2 long arms and 2 short legs, huge dinner plate hands and hair all over it. We put our scopes on it and were scared shitless. It was not an elk, it was not a dude. We were getting panicked as it came closer and closer and got inside 100 yards from us. We all stood up and put our rifles on it. It was about 200 feet lower in elevation than us at that point. And when it saw us, it froze up in a kind of holy pasture for about 2 seconds. Then it turned 90 degrees and went straight at the side of the canyon. It wasn't really running, but it was definitely hauling ass. I never saw it again. But I did find some tracks right across the road into the other canyon. Hunter orange was not required in 1982, but I never saw another hunter that hasn't worn at least a red plaid shirt or an orange hat. Anyone walking through this area in a hair suit on the general elk opener would be a suicidal dumbass. I did not take a picture, but want to share it with you. It's real and exactly what I saw in the bright sunshine on October 30th, 1982. That son of a bitch had a 6-pack. I believe it was taken in the North Cascades in the late 80s, and of course our own father said we must have been smoking some funny stuff. You know what, it's kind of funny when people always say that in an encounter, and they'll say, oh, we're not doing any drugs. We must have been smoking some of the wacky backy, okay? Well, guess what you guys are all doing? People that can't take and accept this topic if it was drugs. That made over 10,000 people alone noted recorded encounters if there's drugs. That made you see an 8 to 9 foot tall, hairy, upright creature. Then every single person that went for an operation and went under anesthesia or whatever painkillers would be seeing 8 or 9 foot hairy people in the hospital room. People that raves would be chronically talking about the 8 foot tall, hairy dudes you see when you get to the right height. That doesn't happen to people who do drugs. Do not report seeing a hairy upright beings non-stop. It just doesn't freaking happen. And if it was chronic upright hairy beings that marijuana caused you to see, they'd probably use them in advertisements as a plateau of being stoned level, which, no, it always doesn't happen, because drugs don't make you think you see 8 to 9 foot tall hairy beings only while you're in the forest. Okay, guys. So you could probably drop they're probably smoking wacky tobacco thing or doing drugs, because it just doesn't fit. There are people doing drugs in every single major city and every single freaking rave place, a nightclub. And there are people on drugs in every single hospital. And there isn't one recorded setting of an 8 to 9 foot tall being in these places because of the drugs are doing. Get your heads out of your asses, right? There's my rant anyway. Carry on. I've also been going salmon fishing on Vancouver rounds since the 1980s. My parents telegraphed a code in 1998. I saw a Sasquatch run down and dive into the water from the most west. From the westernmost point of West Craycroft Island, wherever, that is probably on the inside. Meaning inside Vancouver Island it surfaced once, and I never saw it again. The currents can rip through there at times, so I don't know if it was catching the current to travel or just getting out of sight when it did surface. One time, it reminded me of a Celian taking a breath, and I was locked onto a Beano's then and never saw it again. Had I not seen it run into the water, I would not have noticed that it wasn't a lion. I was just there for 3 weeks before. Fishing was good, and I didn't see any Sasquatches, so it was a good trip.
I'm a First Nations person from British Columbia. I live in Vancouver, and am a member of the legal profession for reasons of privacy. I only ask you keep my name off of what I'm about to say, cause it pertains to our sacred ceremonial ways every year in preparation for the annual Sundance ceremonies. The dances are fasting in the woods, what is often called the Vision Quest ceremony. We have been having our sun dances on the reserve in the BC interior, and even though we moved it from the Nikon Valley to where we now face direct into the Stein Valley, from the east city off the Fraser River, we still go back to that old spot on a different reserve and a different valley for our fasting camp. I no longer want to do my fasting at Nicholas Valley location because of my experiences. Our Sundance chief remarked once or several years back, probably around 2012, that Bigfoot had been there in the Vision Quest grounds. He said it was so nonchalantly, like it was nothing to be alarmed about anyhow. What we do is place with other fasters, often about 100 feet from each other. We bring a sleeping bag and a tarp to keep dry, and also our ceremonial items when fasting. It usually lasts for 4 days. No food or water. Part of my difficulty is that I snore kind of loud, so when out there fasting in the middle of the night, whatever's out there can hear me snoring. One night, I felt my head being pushed into the ground. That was when I woke up after I don't know maybe 10 seconds or so. I made a grunt-like sound. After that I was okay. I was sure I was waking up by that. But I had been in a heavy sleep and part of me questioned if it happened at all. Or if I was just dreaming. It's pitch black outside. So I just stayed in my bag under my tarp. For the rest of the fast that year was fine. I later heard of a faster that had something sit on him. He figured it was a bear. But I think I definitely heard from a source the Sasquatch sometimes sits on people. On another occasion, I'm guessing it was 2014 or 2015 while fasting at the same location. It was daytime, I could see across the river, a person or something dark over across the river was walking through a field near the forest. It was too far away for me to see if it was a Sasquatch or a person. I can only make out the details of a person that looks so dark. No details of clothing, just someone walking. I don't remember if it was the next night or not, but this next part is what happened. It was early in the morning when It was early in the morning. Light started to come out while I was sleeping in my sleeping bag. And that year I had my black plastic lumber wrap for a tarp. It made so much noise every time I shifted about. The tarps also make a lot of noise. The cold air during May's long weekend usually comes with rain, as we are fasting, so the plastic tarps are what keep us dry and warm from the cold and wet wind. I must have been sleeping quite heavily as I guessed. I had been snoring as usual. I heard something run towards me. That's when I woke up. Whatever came to mind me came quickly, as if it were charging me, kind of like a thump. Thump, thump, as he got closer to me and then stopped beside me with a big thump. Whatever it was just so close to me, right outside my circle of tobacco ties that surrounded me. I laid inside my circle of tobacco ties and held my sacred ceremonial pipe close. I prayed quietly in my mind. But I was afraid to make a move. I was afraid to open the tarp. I was afraid to sit up and confront whatever it was that was out there. There were no vocalizations. Just the sound of something outside my fasting altar bouncing around right close to my head. And maybe there were two, but I couldn't really tell. I kept hearing what sounded like antlers being rubbed together. I grew up knowing about hunting and whatnot. And I know the sounds of antlers when you rub them together. Anyhow, this went on for quite a while, and all I could do was pray hard in my silence, not daring to move. In my mind, I knew it was a Sasquatch because of its heavy presence. It's bouncing around right outside. And because it's making those scraping sounds as if there were two bucks outside my spot. And they're fighting each other with antlers. Then that would have been a different sound for sure. What I heard was a Sasquatch bouncing around outside where I was fasting. And it had these antlers being rubbed together. The owner thought that the only another thought I had was that it would have long fingernails being rubbed against each other, which is likely a possibility as well. So eventually, it moved on and left me alone. I didn't set up or look outside until to heard other people starting to wake up. And that was probably at least an hour after the Sasquatch left me. I had laid still praying for that very long time. That happened on the last night of the fast. And when our helpers came to get us up the hill sometime later in the morning, such as 8 or 9, I'm guessing whatever happened to me, it must have been around 5 a.m. I was sure that the other fasters close to me would have heard or seen something, but no one else did. When I finally got released from my fasting altar, I looked closely at the ground, where this being had run up to me and stomped before bouncing around to my head. I was specifically looking for Sasquatch footprints, but there were none. It was not that type of weather to find the perfect footprint on the ground. Also, the ground was kind of dry with pine needles and pine cones instead, etc. There were no footprints. But there was a couple places where the ground was obviously disturbed. Whatever it was that ran up to me stomped in front of my fasting altar. And it did what I described to you. I could see where it was jumping about as the ground was clearly disturbed, but just no tracks. I'm glad the First Nations people Cherie's story about being in a tent had been approached by a Sasquatch and hearing the very same kinds of sounds that I, on a different occasion, had heard. Now that I know this is what they do, I've tried to figure it out, and I imagine if Sasquatch takes a person, those might use these antlers to impale. There are people that go missing. And I'm not convinced the Sasquatch are only friendly beings. Some say it's a blessing to see one. I've been told to never put your foot inside the track. There's a spiritual dimension involved. But I'm convinced that they're real and are out there. There had been Sasquatch sightings just last year, right in the village area of one of the neighboring reserves there in the Nicola Valley. I do not want to add that one time I worked in Kamloops at the old Indian residential school. Wasn't there for too long, but I met the janitor. He told me he was going to fast up in the Stein Valley and that he always does every year. He always goes out alone in my circle of sun dancers. We usually have helpers put us out for a place to fast, but he was not in my circle. And he did things differently than what I was trained to do. Anyhow, that year he never came back from his fasting. Nobody's seen him since. Thanks for sharing this information, and the reason I put this out there is because the only way as humanity can come to understand what the Sasquatch is and how it operates, by sharing our stories together. Through this sharing, crowdsourcing, that we are able to collectively build a more common body of knowledge. Now I know for sure that what I heard that night was not just from fasting, and that other Sasquatch and other locations made the exact noise I heard. Maybe it was the scraping of the long sharp fingernails. Or maybe it was the scraping of the two antlers together, or even if it was just sticks. These are sounds that are frightening to me. I have no desire to go back there and fast again where this happened to me. Thank you and kindest regards.